Well, welcome everyone to another episode of eLedgers Explain. This has been a phenomenally useful tool for a number of our friends and stakeholders to learn about some of the nuances associated with the eLedgers accounting approach. And today, Bob and I are delighted to be joined by two of our board members, Alicia Seiger and Arun Majumdar. Alicia and Arun have been tireless and early supporters of the work we're doing, and they both come at it from very different perspectives. So whilst you've heard a lot from Bob and me on the various eLedgers issues, we thought what would be useful in this conversation is to get a sense from Alicia and Arun on some of the issues that are animating your interest in eLedgers and bring their distinctive perspectives on it. Just by way of quick introductions, Alicia Seiger is a principal, climate principal at the Zuckerberg Institute, and she is also a fellow at Stanford University. And she has been a thought leader in the space of carbon accounting for a very long time. She's been a member of the board of Ceres for a good number of years. She also wrote an incredibly thoughtful book on carbon accounting that in some sense diagnosed the issues to which eLedgers is a possible solution. And so it was Alicia's book that brought us to Alicia. And since then, she's been a phenomenal thought partner and supporter of the work that Bob and I have been doing. Arun Majumdar is the founding dean of Stanford Door School. He's also the founding director of ARPA-E in the Department of Energy and has been one of the world's most highly regarded scientists in the space of energy. And he has, of course, amongst his numerous accolades, added to it the responsibility of serving as a board member of the eLedgers Institute, where he serves as a very thoughtful advisor in the work we're trying to do. So thank you, Alicia and Arun, for taking the time to join us for this session. I thought maybe a place for us to start is how would you describe the eLedgers approach in your own words, and what is its significance to the problems that you encounter every day in the climate space?
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Karthik, and for inviting us to join you today. I mean, as you noted, this book that was a collaboration with my colleagues at Stanford at the Sustainable Finance Initiative, the book was essentially a giant diagnostic of all the ways in which net zero, which had ascended to the dominant organizing principle of climate action, was going to struggle to carry the weight of its ambition. And so we identified these four unsettled accounts, and I'll walk through them quickly because I find them really helpful in understanding the magic of the eLedger solution. But they were data, boundaries, timing, and obligation. So data is this idea that the data that we were using to evaluate emissions information is very noisy, and in most cases estimated and averaged and overlapping, which leads to the account of boundaries. This idea that there are in the current system overlapping and confusing boundaries that make it really difficult to track actual emissions. Timing, this idea that net zero is a flow concept and we're applying it to a stock problem, and so there's little attention to the atmospheric accumulation of emissions over time. And then finally, this issue of obligations. Even if you solve the other three accounts, what are fiduciaries to do with this information? It's hard for emitters to be held accountable for estimates or activity outside their control. So what was so elegant, and as you recall, Rebecca Henderson, our mutual friend, had read our book and your work and said, you guys need to talk, which was a wonderful opportunity to then find this solution set that actually settled these unsettled accounts. And so the eLedger system, by applying the principles of financial accounting to emissions management, settled the four unsettled accounts that we had identified in the book, and in such an elegant and intuitive way, like a value-added tax, tracking emissions information across geographically dispersed and complex global supply chains. So it actually helps us understand what people are actually doing and applies in the same way the advent of generally accepted accounting principles and financial accounting helped reduce fraud in the wake of the Great Depression. eLedgers provides that basis for accountability and clear and consistent information for decision makers working to address climate change.
Arun?
Yeah, first of all, Karthik, thanks for the introduction and delighted to be here with you, Bob, and Alicia. Um, I think we all have the common goal of how do we live in a carbon constrained world. I think everyone realizes that we have to constrain our carbon. And every dollar we spend, even when we buy a cup of coffee, um, has behind it lots of contributions to the carbon emissions that comes out that's embedded in the coffee. And I think it's very important for businesses and governments and other organizations to have an accounting, a tracking ways of how in this massive global network of goods and services that are flowing, how is carbon accounted for? And what eLedgers is doing is to bring in some rigor in the accounting principles that have been developed in other fields into the carbon world. And I think that brings, brings in a lot of, I would say, confidence that when we are decarbonizing, we're planning to decarbonize, we're doing it at the right places and not the wrong ones. And at the end of the day, it's still carbon emissions that we have to reduce. And so this gives some insight into what is really contributing and what is not. And I think and from the energy viewpoint, a big fraction, a large fraction of the emissions come from energy. And the energy is either electricity or it is oil and gas and coal, fossil fuel. If you take the latter, it's a global network of movement of oil, gas, and coal, and you need an accounting principle for that of how oil, gas, and coal from around the world that is moving around, how that is embedded in the coffee that I'm drinking. And I think that requires some rigor and some accounting principles to make sure that we have accuracy in that.
Yeah. So, Arun, if I could just follow up, and
Sure.
we appreciate your accurate description of what eLedgers provides, but and Alicia, also for you on having better accountability, how does this lead to reduced emissions? Could you go down to the next level, a micro level, and let's stipulate that you now have this accurate, valid information. So far, no emissions have been reduced. What's the next step that this kind of information, both from an engineering point of view, perhaps, and the energy point of view, as well as from the environmental community, is going to reduce the emissions dramatically over the next 10 years?
That's a great question, Bob. I mean, I look at it two different ways. One is, and from a technology point of view, we have a saying that cleaner needs to be cheaper, and that's really the only way, without anything else, that clean will get adopted and reduce emissions. But it takes time. The other way to think about it is that we are living in a world where 80% of the energy supply, more than 80%, comes from fossil fuel, and that leads to emissions. And if you're really serious about reducing emissions, there needs to be some way to account for the externalities. Now, of course, today it's very hard right now. That's either in a policy, either you have some carrots or sticks. And right now we don't have that, at least in the United States right now. But in other parts of the world, people are introducing those. But when you introduce those carrots and sticks, you need an accounting principle to be able to say, how much do you have to pay? Or how much do you save? And that has direct implications on the financial world. And I think that's why the accounting principle is being developed right now is critical to be able to evaluate whether a certain approach, whether it's cleaner, cheaper, or whether there's some price on the externalities, either by regulation or by market mechanisms, is accounted for. So I think this is fundamental layer on which this is the foundation on which you could add on other things.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to the comments I wanted to make in response to your question, Bob. But it needs to be acknowledged that there is a foundation on which this work builds too. You know, I've been working in climate for 3 decades. I've been a part of and greatly respect and appreciate my colleagues who have been hard at work in the current system that I think of as a reporting framework, and we can get into the difference between reporting and accounting, but there has been a foundation of counting emissions for risk management purposes, for advocacy, for helping companies make product design and use decisions. And the way I see it is as we've tried to take that system from a voluntary basis to a regulated basis, and as we've tried to carry the weight of billions of dollars of investment to trillions of dollars of investment, we need to ratchet the granularity and rigor of that foundation. And so it's building on the work that has been done that can get us to a place where we can solve, I see it as kind of 3 primary opportunities. One is building the basis for competitive markets for decarbonization. The second is this true and fair basis to hold emitters accountable. As Arun was saying, you can't impose penalties on emitters unless you have that true and fair basis. And then the third really animating piece, particularly in the context of the Zuckerberg Initiative, is building a market for carbon removals, that we know we need this technology. It is very difficult to scale a new technology when you don't have buyers for it or a price signal. And so that's a particularly animating opportunity that I think is, it's a derivative, so it's harder to see. But that's a really key place where I think e-ledgers can really add value.
That's super helpful. And both of you have sort of stressed this notion of the accounting not just being a tool for measurement, but a tool for driving innovation, for driving, in some sense, a shift in the strategy that's needed. But as Alicia mentions, this is a system that builds upon an existing infrastructure, a fairly mature ecosystem, at least in terms of the longevity that it's been deployed now, almost 2.5 to 3 decades. And so when you have, in some sense, a transformational approach that comes in underneath that, naturally perhaps elicits curiosity, but also fear and criticism. What are some questions or concerns that the communities in which you're embedded might have about e-ledgers as an approach, and how might you sort of address or assuage those concerns?
Sure, I can take this one first since I just lived it. To me, there are 4 big questions. The first is, what about downstream emissions? And I'll walk through them all and come back. The second is, what does this do to the current voluntary market? The third is, what about data? Do we actually have the ability to do this? And the fourth is, what about the global south? And I think on the downstream question, it's actually simpler than it appears, in the sense that 80% of emissions can be accounted for from cradle to gate through commercial activity and supply chains. So really what we're talking about is is household fuel combustion. And that is not in the domain of accounting, right? Accounting can't verify what hasn't happened yet. So it is necessarily an estimate and out of the control of the seller of the product. So it doesn't mean we don't need to attend to it. Of course we need to attend to it, but there are different tools for that, and that's applying the tools that are fit to purpose. That is the domain of reporting and disclosure. That is where policy must play a role. You need efficiency standards and bans and mandates, and it's a great role for, again, disclosure and advocacy. So that's the sort of what about downstream. The other thing I guess I would say is, because people also think, well, you're passing this information down to your suppliers, so it's not your responsibility anymore. But if you think about the rise of net zero, we got 80% of global emissions under some sort of net zero claim. That claim would say that you aren't passing emissions down to your supplier, that you are net zero. Now, of course, we're a long way between here and there, but the idea is that it makes net zero real and accountable, or you just compete again for lower carbon products and services to your customers.
So
On the
Alicia,
voluntary,
could I pause
yeah.
you without you
Yeah.
losing track of the other two reasons?
Uh,
Because it was also mentioned that gives us a way of holding emitters accountable.
Mhm.
But to me, it's not just emitters, it's everyone who purchased the product where the emitter occurs. So actually it increases accountability to anyone downstream when you purchase a product with substantial amount of emissions associated with its production upstream, you're accountable for that. So it's actually just the opposite of the stereotypical information by having every customer down a supply chain becoming accountable for the decisions it made to allow those emissions to have occurred upstream.
I love the distinction and clarification, Bob, and it also reminds me to make the additional point that in that sense, this tool helps drive down the use of fossil fuels across the whole global. It's not just putting it on like consumer automotive use. It actually creates incentive alignment to decarbonize not just fuel use. People think, but wait, doesn't it let oil and gas off the hook? No, it drives pressure to use lower emissions oil and gas across the globe, supply chain before it even reaches the household.
Or by all their corporate customers. And by all their corporate customers who are using it in their production processes and, in their vehicles as well.
And remember, it's not just fossil fuels, which is really what animates the climate community, but it's steel, cement, all the, hard to decarbonize materials and sectors. It again aligns incentives and enables competition and decommodification.
So why don't you continue? I think it was a good clarification on that.
Yeah, no, very much so. Appreciate it. On the VC, on the question of what the momentum we have now and the corporate climate commitments and the budgets that are all built on this reporting system, it's a really important question. We need to build bridges for how to work with the leaders and the tools that we have and introduce new tools that are fit to other purposes. And so this principle of do no harm, I think, is really important. And I think that's something that will evolve with collaboration and communication and our sights set on the shared objectives. On data, this is a tough one. There's a lot of work to do. I mean, there's a reason why we started with estimates and averages. I think we've come a long way in the science of measurement and the technology of measurement, and there's certain processes that we really do have all the information. We just don't currently have a system that provides the incentives to use it or to get better at it. Land use is tough. Like, we still have an issue there, and we need more innovation and more tools to be able to better to improve data availability and data quality. There's also a need for an open data architecture. Again, this is something that animates CZI to build out that open data architecture on both sides of the ledger, create the governance and transparency, availability, and quality that's going to be necessary for that. And then there's also a role for policy to phase in, to align incentives to improve that data. And the last thing I'll say on the Global South, because this is something I find really interesting and compelling about e-ledgers and isn't often discussed, which is that, again, because it starts at the cradle of supply chains and moves information forward, it is in its own way a just transition strategy because it aligns incentive for investment in the Global South where most supply chains originate. So I find that question, I love it when we get that question because I think there's a good answer to it.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is, and I'm going to use my personal analogy. If I want to go on a diet, I need to know what I'm eating and how much calories are there and how much fat or carbs and sugar and all of that. And I, not that it has worked in my case, but let's say, it has worked in other people's cases. And I need to exercise as well to burn some of those calories. So there's a mechanism, there's a framework on how I figure out how much calories is there in my food. If we want the world to go in a carbon diet while still growing the economy, I mean, that's what we are, right? This is people think that the 20th century paradigm has been, if you want to grow your economy, your GDP, then your emissions are going to go up. Well, we're trying to create a different paradigm right now in a carbon constrained world. We have financial accounting for the GDP and all that. I think what eLedgers is trying to do is to create the accounting for the carbon emissions so that now you could hopefully decouple them and have proper accountability. So if someone or an organization or a country wants to go on a carbon diet, they know exactly what to do. Otherwise, if the foundation of accounting is fuzzy, you may be going down the wrong track, which in my weight loss thing I have, but I didn't have the right accounting. So, I'm trying to simplify it, but that's how I look at this, that you need this new paradigm. If you want to change the paradigm of how economic growth happens, you need a way to measure on the carbon side so that you can decouple in a cost-effective way with proper accountability.
That's very compelling and helpful. And are there particular criticisms, Arun, that you come across in your sort of scientific communities of this paradigm shift that you might help us sort of navigate?
I think, so at Stanford, we work with lots of companies, including fossil fuel companies. And I think the general long-term view is that they are trying to figure out how to get into a low carbon economy, right? And I think they realize long term we will be living in a carbon constrained world. Now, next month to month, quarter to quarter, we have to focus on shareholders' interest and all of that. But the long term shareholder interest is that there needs to be some carbon accountability. I think people realize that. And they want a framework that is transparent, that is accurate, right? And as Alicia pointed out, you need data to make sure, with uncertainties in the data as well. And that is a common, it cannot be that one corporation uses one accounting principle, another one uses another, then you have a problem. So it needs to be somewhat standardized. And this is where hopefully the government can come in and provide some level of acceptance of some standards, and thereby enable the businesses and other organizations to be able to do. So I think the long-term people accept that. I think people are really struggling right now. Corporations and others are struggling with how to manage their carbon accountability in the supply chain. It's very hard. And I think this framework allows one to do that in a way that is transparent.
That's very helpful. I know we only have a few minutes left, but when we have our guests on the eLedgers Explain channel, one of the things that the viewers love to hear from is what it is you're working on yourselves. And so if you were to look ahead to the next, 3 to 4 years, what are the major problems that you hope to be solving in your own sort of professional careers outside or maybe related to the mission of eLedgers?
Alicia, go ahead.
Sure. Well, mine's going to be very much in the slipstream of this conversation. It's continuing to improve and demonstrate the value of of carbon accounting, which includes additional innovation on the data side in terms of availability and quality and open architecture. I am thinking a lot about and animated around the questions of this bridge between the current system and the new system. There's, I think about the messy middle of navigating that space and how do we move in the direction of this North Star that I think really helps make global carbon management and accountability a real thing without, again, doing any harm and without violating accounting principles that will send us back to square one. I've seen, I started working the carbon markets 20 plus years ago. I've seen the movie of the rise and fall many, many times. And I really believe that accounting is the foundation on which we can build real carbon markets. It is the foundation. We've got people doing work on the 10th floor right now, and we need to build the floors to get to put solid ground underneath their feet. That's a lot of fascinating work around market structure, legal and regulatory, a structure that doesn't yet exist where we're actually trading carbon, and there is a cure when those trades fail, where emissions are recognized as long duration liabilities. There's a whole set of questions that are really fascinating and compelling to me, and that's what I spend my time thinking of. I do have other activities and interests outside of carbon accounting and carbon markets, but that's certainly what comes to mind in this conversation.
Well, my primary job is my day job is to get this school up and running and in a very strong position with faculty, students, staff, the education, the curriculum that we're developing, as well as the research enterprise that we are creating, including getting things launched out of Stanford. And so this is 95% of my time.
Splendid. Well, Alicia and Arun, thank you so much for taking the time to engage with us in this episode of eLedgers Explain. And thank you also for your continued advice and engagement with the project. And to our viewers, we invite you to comment on other ideas and guests that you'd like to see as part of this podcast series. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you for putting this together and hosting a few of Stanford people.